With all due respect to the spooky pyramid and the weird floating eye, the US dollar's power doesn't come from it being a special currency. It's the infrastructure underneath it, or rather the lack of an alternative, that has made the dollar almighty. For decades, you either played by America's rules or you were shut out of the global financial system it designed. But that's starting to change. There's a new set of rails that allows countries to do business without going through America's toll booth. It's not replacing the dollar system, but it might not need to. My name is Nick, and this is Coin Bureau Finance. The infrastructure the whole world relies on to send international payments is based on the US dollar. And for most of the last 80 years, if you wanted to move money internationally, you've had no choice but to use it. And that's meant routing your transfer through US banks, which means US jurisdiction, which has made Washington your permanent middleman. And that makes you subject not only to US banking regulations, but also the moral judgment of the State Department. If they don't approve of your government, don't expect the best user experience with that international transfer. Actually, don't expect to be able to use the system at all, because you'll most likely be shown the door and handed a raft of punishments preventing you from sending and receiving money internationally. And then you're really out of luck, because what else are you going to do? Cash in the mail? You had better just keep your head down and keep Uncle Sam happy to avoid any trouble. And this is the foundation of dollar hegemony. It's not as greasy as the politics of the petrodollar, and somehow it manages to sound even duller than central banks' bond holdings, but the ultimate choke point is arguably control of the world's settlement layer. If a company in Thailand wants to buy oil from the UAE, they can't pay each other directly. Instead, payment is routed through a chain of correspondent banks, almost always in New York, almost always denominated in US dollars. The mechanics work like this. The Thai bank debits the importer's account, credits its correspondent bank in New York. The New York bank debits the Thai bank's account, credits the UAE bank's correspondent account, also in New York. And then the UAE bank credits the exporter. The money travels halfway around the world to settle a transaction between two countries that share a border across the Indian Ocean. And this happens because there's no deep liquid market for trading Thai baht directly with UAE dirhams. The dollar serves as the vehicle currency, the bridge between minor currency pairs. Settlement takes between 2 and 5 days. Fees stack up at every single hop, often $40 or more for a single corporate transaction. And banks are forced to park an estimated $120 billion globally in what are known as nostro accounts, which are foreign currency accounts held with correspondent banks, just to grease these wheels. It's an arcane and incredibly inefficient system, but for the US, it's a geopolitical superweapon. 95% of dollar payments clear through the New York-based clearinghouse interbank payments system. And that's CHIPS, although the P may as well be for panopticon, because it makes the US Treasury free to surveil, delay, or freeze the world's transactions. For example, in 2012, Iranian banks were expelled from SWIFT. The whole banking system was just cut off from global finance. Iran's economy was strangled without a single bomb being dropped. The national currency collapsed. Inflation became a permanent feature of daily life. Ordinary people storing their savings in the rial had to watch their wealth get vaporized because Washington and its then allies in Europe decided their government wasn't pliable enough. 10 years later, the G7 froze $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves that were held as government bonds in European custody, where they were supposedly protected by sovereign immunity. But when it suited them, Western powers just said, psych. That legal principle was fake and made up, and just confiscated Russia's assets. And never mind Russia, Western European companies operating inside the country paid the price for that too, because Russia pinched their assets in retaliation. Take that, Carlsberg. But Iran and Russia are only the most prominent names among the triple-digit list of countries and territories who have been cut off from the global payment system by the West's sanctions. And if your economy can be turned off by bureaucrats in a hostile foreign country, why not try switching to a different service provider? So it's no surprise then that an alternative cross-border payments system outside of Washington's control is growing at a rapid clip. And you've probably heard of mBridge before, and we've been talking about it for years now, and it's been more than a decade in the making. In the 2022 pilot phase, mBridge handled $22 million in transactions, placing it firmly in the cute experiment but will never catch on territory. By now, though, we have a pretty good answer to that question. By late 2025, mBridge had handled $55 billion. That's a 2,500-fold increase in 3 years, which suggests that this is no longer a science project. To be sure, $55 billion is still a speck on the windshield of global finance. Chips alone clears nearly $2 trillion daily. mBridge is not competing on scale, and it's definitely not replacing the dollar-based global system. It has no bearing on capital markets, portfolio flows, or consumer payments. That's not the point. Instead, it competes on jurisdiction. And this is the real pressure point for the US, because its ability to coerce other countries with economic sanctions and enforce binary outcomes depends on the world having to pass through the New York toll booth to transfer money across borders. And you don't need to replace a monopoly to break it. You just need to give people another choice. So far, mBridge connects the central banks of China, Hong Kong, Thailand, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia. It uses a permissioned blockchain where central banks and authorized commercial banks operate nodes, which enable the exchange of tokenized central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs. From a technical standpoint, the gap between SWIFT and mBridge is like the gap between telegrams and the internet. SWIFT is just a messaging protocol. It transmits instructions between banks saying, please move this money. The actual settlement happens separately, often days later, through systems like chips. And that separation is where the delays, counterparty risk, and fees creep in. mBridge collapses that distinction. It uses what's called atomic settlement, meaning the payment instruction and the transfer of value happen simultaneously. So, no more gap between messaging and settlement, no multi-day waits, and no chain of intermediaries taking cuts. A commercial bank in Hong Kong can transact directly with a commercial bank in the UAE using CBDCs, and the whole thing settles in seconds. The platform runs on a custom consensus protocol called Dashing, which was developed by the People's Bank of China's Digital Currency Institute. Dashing achieves finality in seconds, not blazing fast by blockchain standards, but still a completely different league from the ironically titled SWIFT, where settlement routinely takes days. There's no settlement risk window. The transaction either completes or it doesn't happen at all. As a CBDC transfer mechanism, mBridge is so far dominated by China's digital yuan. The e-CNY is the world's largest CBDC program to date and accounts for around 95% of the volume settled on mBridge. The liquidity is Chinese, the infrastructure is Chinese. Other members are using the system, but China built it. Originally, mBridge was incubated by the Bank for International Settlements Innovation Hub in Hong Kong. The BIS is often described as the central bank of central banks, the institution that coordinates standards and best practices across the world's major monetary authorities. While formally multilateral, it is, in effect, one of the West's cops on the beat, enforcing the US-dominated consensus about how countries should conduct their finances. As long as mBridge was framed as a technical experiment, a sandbox for testing blockchain-based cross-border settlement, that was acceptable. The BIS was explicit that the project could not be used for sanctions evasion and had to remain compatible with existing compliance regimes. So it was quite eyebrow-raising then when in October 2024, after mBridge reached minimal viable product status, the BIS announced it was pulling out. Once mBridge crossed the bridge from experiment to operational infrastructure, the BIS washed its hands of the project, leaving its future in the hands of the participating countries. In effect, this meant the complete withdrawal of Western institutional oversight. Today, mBridge is governed by a steering committee made up by the member central banks, but the specialized subcommittees reveal who actually controls the project. The Technology Subcommittee, which oversees the code base and the Dash-in protocol, is chaired by the People's Bank of China's Digital Currency Institute. The Business Subcommittee is chaired by the UAE. The Legal Subcommittee is chaired by Hong Kong. The Policy Subcommittee is chaired by the Bank of Thailand. It's a clear division of labor. China builds the engine, Gulf states develop the use cases, Hong Kong handles the legal architecture, and Thailand coordinates policy. When the BIS was still involved, its general manager, Augustin Carstens, made a point of stressing that mBridge was, quote, not the BRICS bridge, and could not be used to bypass sanctions. But the BIS doesn't make the rules anymore. Compliance enforcement now rests with the member states themselves, and they have a different idea about the legitimacy of Western sanctions. The ring-fencing mechanism intended to keep sanctioned entities off the platform are likely to defer to UN Security Council designations where China and Russia hold veto power, rather than unilateral US Treasury listings. And this means that if China and the UAE agree that a transaction is legal within mBridge, the United States has no power to freeze it, block it, or even see it, short of secondary sanctions, diplomatic pressure, or physical violence. And this is where mBridge doesn't need to replace SWIFT to be a big deal. It only needs to work for a narrow set of politically sensitive transactions, like energy trade, commodity settlement, or bilateral trade between non-West aligned states, where legal finality matters more than scale. The US isn't about to lose all of its surveillance and censorship powers all at once, but they are starting to erode at the margins. Speaking of margins eroding, if you're active in the markets and you're trying to keep yours intact, you need to stay on top of the stories behind all the volatility. And you're in luck too, because we've put together a weekly newsletter breaking down the biggest stories in global finance. And we've also secured some exclusive finance-related deals for viewers of this channel, and you can find out more about that using the link in the description or scanning this QR code. The newsletter is completely free and the deals are exclusively for our viewers. Back to the video. However, without liquidity, the mBridge infrastructure is just empty pipes. And for years, this looked like an Achilles heel for mBridge. The digital yuan, which is just about the only thing going through those pipes at the moment, worked as a payment tool, but not as a store of value. It also paid no interest, which meant that anyone holding it was guaranteed to lose money relative to a bank deposit or a treasury bill. And that made it fine for retail transactions inside China, but deeply unattractive for cross-border settlement. Why would a Saudi bank or a Thai importer want to hold digital yuan if they earned nothing on them? Not only do you get zero returns, but China's capital controls mean you can't even recycle those balances elsewhere at a short notice. And that didn't bode well for adoption, either for mBridge or e-CNY. And apparently, the People's Bank of China took notice because they recently introduced a framework allowing commercial banks to pay interest on e-CNY wallet balances. And this happened without much fanfare, but it represents a massive upgrade for China's CBDC, which stopped being just a payment instrument and started functioning like a yield-bearing balance. For foreign banks settling trades on mBridge, this is transformational because instead of watching yuan balances gathering dust between the transactions, they can now earn a yield. And that turns liquidity from a cost into an asset, and it gives banks a reason to stay inside the system. mBridge members' currency pairs may never have the liquidity of US dollar foreign exchange pairs, but they do benefit from the enormous domestic scale of the e-CNY, which has been used in more than $2.3 trillion worth of transactions inside China. And this means mBridge is ready to support wholesale settlement without relying on offshore dollar funding. And then there's programmability. The digital yuan was built to support smart contracts, allowing payments to be tied directly to real-world events. Consider a standard oil trade between a Chinese buyer and a Saudi seller. Neither side fully trusts the other. Traditionally, the transaction routes through a letter of credit issued by a Western bank, adding days of processing time, jurisdictional exposure, and fees on both ends. On mBridge, programmable settlement can replace the intermediary. A contract can be written so that the payment releases automatically when a digital bill of lading is uploaded and cryptographically verified, or when satellite data confirms a tanker crossed a specific GPS coordinate, or when funds are released from escrow after inspection at the destination port. The conditions are flexible, the execution is automatic, and the trust is mathematical rather than institutional. For countries that can't access Western banks, either because they've been sanctioned or because they'd rather not subject themselves to US jurisdiction, programmable settlement removes that choke point entirely. So, mBridge has become a full package. A payment rail that bypasses New York, a currency with actual yield, domestic liquidity in the trillions, and smart contracts that automate trust. The rails, plus the train, plus the fuel. Now, aside from China, the most consequential member of mBridge is Saudi Arabia's central bank, which signed up in June 2024. For the last half-century, oil has been priced in dollars and settled through dollar-denominated banking infrastructure that clears through New York. That arrangement has been the cornerstone of dollar dominance since the 1970s. But with Saudi Arabia on mBridge, the infrastructure now exists to settle oil trades in digital yuan or digital rial, completely bypassing the dollar system entirely. The plumbing alone isn't enough, though. You also need liquidity. And in November 2023, China and Saudi Arabia signed a 50 billion yuan currency swap agreement worth roughly $7 billion. A swap line gives Saudi Arabia direct access to yuan reserves without touching foreign exchange markets or relying on the offshore dollar funding. So if Riyadh wants to accept digital yuan for an oil shipment, they don't need to worry about converting it on foreign exchange markets or finding counterparties. They have a pre-positioned credit line with the People's Bank of China. Now, a $7 billion swap line isn't going to cover the $200 billion worth of oil Saudi Arabia exports every year. But again, that's not the point. This was a pilot program proving the rails work. The flow is currently a trickle compared to the ocean of dollar-denominated oil trade, but the alternative infrastructure is installed and up and running should countries ever need a plan B. 2023 is a long time ago in mBridge years though, and the pilot phase is now over. Late last year, the UAE Ministry of Finance executed the first government cross-border payment using its digital dirham on mBridge. That's real sovereign money moving through sovereign infrastructure for an actual transaction. With the system now operational, bypassing a sanction would be mechanically very straightforward. If China wants to buy oil from Iran or gas from Russia and settle the payment via mBridge, the transaction happens on the mBridge ledger, denominated in e-CNY. There are no correspondent banks involved, no chip settlements, no routing through New York. The US doesn't get to surveil the transaction. Washington can't freeze the accounts because it can't even see them. They can't block the payment because they have no jurisdiction over the ledger. 23 central banks, along with the IMF, are now listed as observers of mBridge, including the New York Fed and the Bank of France. They can't shut it down, so they're keeping a foot in the door and taking notes. It's a tacit admission that the system is too significant to ignore, even if they're neither participating nor protesting yet. The petrodollar's enforcement relied on there being no alternative, but that chapter of history is now closed. Whether the mBridge alternative ever gets used at scale is a different question, but just by existing, it does change the playing field, and probably permanently. Washington still has tools, secondary sanctions, export controls, access to dollar funding, and diplomatic leverage over allies. What mBridge removes, though, is the cheapest and most frictionless option: silent enforcement at the settlement layer. Instead of a payment failing automatically inside New York's plumbing, the US now has to act explicitly, publicly, and politically. But explicit enforcement is significantly more costly. It forces allies to take sides, invites retaliation, and is ultimately self-defeating because it encourages the construction of alternative payment systems. Checkmate? Well, if you want to learn more about how the US government is coping with this apparent challenge to global dollar supremacy, why not check out our report on the Trump administration's plan to prosecute Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell? That's right over here. That's all from me now. As always, thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you the next time.